sort of discussion, because sometimes it is more complicated than you had anticipated. Yeah, but it's really good to have this conversation. I think it's something that is quite terrifying and intimidating for a lot of community land ownership groups, and I think it's really important to have kind of more technical discussions about some of the challenges around community land ownership, as well as, you know, the celebrating all our fantastic successes, because behind success is some really difficult mountains that we all climb. And it's really good to kind of share what works and what didn't work in some cases. So the Applecross Community Company is the owner of the trust in the Applecross Peninsula, which is 26,000 hectares land, just to the north of here on mainland, across the top of Rasley and Rona. We have a population of around 260 people, 14 different crofting townships. The community company was set up in 2008 to take on ownership and can ensure the continued supply of a filling station in the community. But since then, we've expanded in many different directions, delivering a whole range of services and also community development projects. And many of these have required us to work with planning department, building control, and other statutory bodies. So if you want to go to the first slide, one project is our community woodland, our Gigha, which is a 14.5 hectare community woodland we built with support from the land fund in 2021. At the time we acquired it, 8 hectares of the site was covered in mature cypress, which needed felling. So since the very beginning of the project, we worked very closely with the Scottish Forestry and all kind of regulations around paperwork and requirements involved in clearing, and then since then restocking and doing woodland condition projects as well. We've just planted 5,000 native broadleaf trees, which we planted and grew on the peninsula in March this year, and we've currently got 4 years funding from the National Lottery Heritage Fund for that project. So because the whole site is designated as a continual preservation with Scottish Forestry, right, the management and redevelopment and regeneration of the site. We also work with planning in terms of permitted development projects. So one example here is the shelter we built with by community volunteers. We've also built a compost toilet. We're going to be doing projects further down the line, which will involve full planning permission. So far, that project has been relatively free, but it's just an example of the different statutory bodies you have to work with in a project like this. If you go to the next slide. But like many of your areas, we also have a crisis of affordable housing. 50% of the houses on the Applecross Peninsula are second home and short-term lets, and it's a significant demand for affordable housing locally within current residents, as well as people wanting to move back to the area. So this has been a really key priority for the community company since we were established in 2008. We've already completed 3 all-access community-owned houses back in 2022. That was done through a design and build contract, and the project was managed by a Community Housing Trust. And this was 3 houses built on a really tiny site, so 25 metres by about 35 metres, and with construction services already on site. So it was a relatively smooth project in terms of planning permission. It was built during COVID, which had all its other complexities in terms of cost and social distancing, building companies and things like that. But nevertheless, that was actually a relatively straightforward project. But 3 houses was never going to meet our full community's needs. So we're also now developing this largest field, just hectares of this field we're developing houses on, and we've just last week completed the map plan of the site, which is up on the right hand of the screen. This project's many years in development, so we got stage 1 land fund funding and did feasibility studies in the pre-application plan inquiry, and we got very favorable view from the planning department about developing the site. Then there was everything that's needed for the stage 2 land fund application in terms of putting the funds together to buy the sites, and now we've just hired architects. Doyle actually are based somewhere just nearby on the almost the campus, and working now on the design and the planning application. Because of the size of the site, we have to be working with the Roads Department, CD Utilities, SSE, and SSE, Oakridge. There are so many different bodies that we have to work with. Particularly planning officer who we've developed a really good relationship with over the years has just retired, so we have a new team now we have to work with. But one thing that's really interesting, it gives us optimism in terms of hoping to streamline the process, is that Hard Council has just launched what they're calling an integrated housing delivery service for medium-sized projects like this, which is supposed to be a kind of table mechanism to try and streamline decisions and information flows around planning applications for projects like this. So we're really hoping that this is going to be easier than previous projects have been. Another big surprise has been that SEPA's new surface water risk maps have just been published, and they capture a much more significant portion of the site than previously captured. So this involves another very expensive survey and may require us to change the layout of this plan, which obviously what happens there. Final slide. And I just mentioned so that it's a church that we bought from Church of Scotland back in 2023. This is a more salutary message really for us, because although we did feasibility studies of the project beforehand, we were not aware just the implications were of the planning permission and building permits that were required, changing a community building as a church into a community hub, which is a different community building, and what that means in terms of completely gutting and reinstalling the entire electrical network and fire regulation, making the buildings compliant with fire regulations. And it was so expensive, it took such a long time. And so that really was one of the key lessons I wanted to sort of end my 8 minutes on, was really the fact that you can never do enough research, and if you do enough research, regulations then change and have to change your plans then. So it's always really important to make sure that you understand fully all risks associated with particular land and assets, and you cost those risks, and you factor in time involved for various different regulatory and statutory processes. And if you're working with a team who undertake feasibility study on your behalf in relation to an asset, make sure that they know that's what you need them to do as well, in terms of just giving you the most up-to-date information. That's one key lesson, I think, from our perspective. The second one is the importance of developing relationships with planning department, with building office inspectors and others, because they can be really, really helpful. And certainly, in our experience, are really supportive of what communities are trying to do to the best they can within the limits of their own areas. And the final thing just to say is that people in the community have rights to object to your planning application, and they probably will do. It's an important part of making sure that process is transparent. And from our experience, having dealt with a number of things, you just have to try and remain calm and respond responsibly, but sort of factor that into your planning at all. Because if you're suddenly faced with massive, unexpected objections at key points, can also delay the process. So thank you. That was a run through of some of the things we're dealing with.
We're going to hear from questions. We're going to hear from Jane, and then we'll do questions. You coming up? There we are.
Okay, hi everyone. My name is MacIntyre, and I'm the Senior Manager for the Education Trust. So just a very quick introduction. The idea of continuing since 2002, following the Carey land. So the trust today owns the majority of the island, which includes both land, buildings and asset worth in the region of £10 billion. At the moment we have 6 trustees and we've got 10 full-time employees. So my presentation structure, similar to there, is just to give you a quick high-level overview of some of our capital projects, and then conclude by talking about the lessons we learned, particularly in relation to dealing with plan applications. So starting off with our capital side, so we launched our plan application in 2019 and the project concluded in 2022. But this project had a series of issues, mostly in relation to the funding packages secured for the project. It was significantly less than we had hoped for at the time, which
into our projects or new drawings. And mainly the applications, revisions to our storylines and revisions to our planning application, a new amendment to our billboard, and the stack kind of went on and on for a long time until we actually were able to put a speed out. So yeah, it costs a lot, it takes a lot of time, and it also can get quite complex in terms of what stage of revision you are on when designing the project. This is our pathway for our project, so funding secured in 2020 and the project is completed by 2023. So we had issues in this project around planning, actually meeting planning permission. We kind of made the assumption that we wouldn't necessarily need planning permission to put pathways on plan, but you know, but we were sat mistaken and had to get planning permission for a number of these paths. Anything that was essentially a new path had to get permission. You can see the photo on the left here. This is our very expensive condition that we had to put in one of our paths was curbing, tarmac, pavement, bollards, all the works. And if you've ever been to Gigha, you would know that there's no pavements anywhere else on the island. So it was a very expensive thing that we had to do, and it doesn't look particularly right on the island at all, but it cost us about £20,000 to just do that tarmacked bit there, so eye-watering, and it also complicated things in terms of our delivery timescales with our funders and also the funding amounts that we had remaining. So it just added a whole layer of complexity which we had not anticipated. Our housing project, so we got our planning, permission in 2021, and the project is almost at completion. This project is actually, it's been very complex in terms of delivering housing. As Megan was saying, it's a big undertaking, but in terms of the sort of difficulties we've had around the planning side of things, it again comes down to the sort of external infrastructure requirements. So car parking provision, turning space, being on an island as well, we struggle to get hot tar to the island, weight restrictions on the ferry. Yeah, it adds a whole other layer of complex. You think you've got your funding, you've got your drawings, you've got your builder, you're going to go, and then you get all these other complex issues that do arise from planning conditions, which are inevitable. Helipad project, so we delivered this project in 2024. It was about delivering an emergency landing site for helicopters, and yeah, we ran into issues again with around planning in terms of the proximity of the helipad to the main road. This site was used for helicopters long before we put the infrastructure that's there today, so it was again entering discussions around, well, this site's already designated for helicopters to land. There's a reason why this site has been used for so many years, and trying to find an alternative site on the island was just, it wasn't going to be feasible, and it would have just, the project wouldn't have happened if we did have to look elsewhere. A refurbishment project, so we've just recently done a bit of renovation work to our hotel, so we weren't actually quite sure what kind of consents we would require for this, and as it turned out, we needed a building warrant and a listed building consent for this. This actually was a lot less complex, but there obviously wasn't an actual planning application required for this, so it was a lot less complex, but again, in hindsight, we would have gotten the permissions in place sooner so that we didn't have so many difficulties with our funding timescales, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with. And final project just to touch on is a project that it's in the pipeline. This is our multi-use games area. So essentially it's a fence pitch for a variety of sports to take place, targeted at our local young children who want to participate in sports. So the plan application for this was originally submitted in September 2023, and we did not get a decision until February 2025. So that gives you an indication of the timescales. There's obviously resourcing issues within the sort of planning departments within local authorities, but we again ran into issues around external infrastructure. I think there's a policy around sports facilities need to have 20 space car parks, which again, if you've been to Gigha, you would know there's nothing like that on the island. We don't have massive car parking spaces.
we have a single track road and some laybys, that's about it. So we again had to have a discussion with our planners about why we didn't feel this was needed for the project, particularly because the purpose of the project is to serve the local community, and they're not going to be bringing their cars, particularly the primary school, which is across the road. They want to use it for their PE, and they're not going to be bringing vehicles. So it was about entering into those conversations again with planners and justifying the project, giving a bit more context, and trying to come to a solution which makes the project deliverable for the community. So to wrap up with some of our lessons learned, I would say at the earliest opportunity, check what permissions are required. So don't be like us with our pathways and assume you don't need permission, because you most likely will, whether that's planning, building warrant, listed building consent, and so on. Engage in the pre-planning application process, even if you think it's not going to tell you anything that you don't already know. Is a good way of engaging with your local authority and your planning department and giving a bit more context about the project and what you're hoping to deliver. Factor in time and expenditure to progress planning applications. So like us, expect delays and certainly allow for that in your timescale. What you could try working with a design team that has experience with your local authority, so they might know a bit more about what to expect from different departments within the planning team, and they might build a good relationship with the planning department, and create a line of communication between yourself and the planning officers, so between yourself as a client and also your design team or your project administrator. Try provide some context around your surroundings and your community. So again, with our multi-use games area project, we really had to demonstrate that there's not an obvious opportunity within the sort of planning application to give a lot of context. It's more about what you're submitting in terms of the design and layout. So that's why it's important to build a sort of line of communication and build a sort of an opportunity to tell them a bit more about that. Try and secure your permissions before you develop a funding package as well, so that takes the pressure off you and your funders if there's planning permission or building warrants already in place. That sometimes is a requirement of the funding, but sometimes it's not. And if you don't need to have your permissions in place prior to getting your funding, it does mean though you have to allow a bit of time and money for that process. And allowing that financial and time contingency in your project. One other thing that's important is finding out if your community has a local place plan. So this is basically an opportunity for your community to tell the local authority what your ambitions are for your community, and it helps feed into the planning decisions. So it helps feed into the local development plans, which your local authority will use when looking at planning applications. And finally, keep your community appraised of progress. Make them aware that it's a long process, make them aware that it's a complex process. Preempt objections. I think Megan touched on that as well. You probably will get objections in some way, shape or form, but try preempt them by making your community as aware of the project as possible. Give them access to designs, give them access to your architect if that helps. We've in some cases asked our architect to give us like 3D visuals, which again helps the community kind of envision it, and then allows them to ask questions around why a specific layout or why a particular material or why the design is the way it is, and it really helps them understand and hopefully get on board with or provide some feedback to the project in a more constructive way. So yeah, just to say thanks for listening and look forward to hopefully being able to answer some questions.
Thanks, Jane. Thanks, Megan, for that. I'll start off with one question, and then we'll go to yourselves in the audience. The question is how both of you, work through those incredibly challenging moments when they arise. What's the process for getting through that? And particularly, what insights do you have in terms of working as directors, as volunteers, different levels of staff in your organization, and how does that work for community landowners?
I think I'm switched on. I think so. When you receive feedback from your planners that's maybe not what you're hoping for, and it creates a bit of
is creating a problem within your project. I think the first thing that I would do in that circumstance is speak to someone within my design team, speak to colleagues about it, and then try create that line of communication with the planner. So obviously everything comes through the different channels. You get your letters through the e-building kind of, or the e-plan platform, but there's nothing to you picking up the phone, speaking to them and asking them to lay it out to you in more simplistic terms, I suppose. A lot of it is policy, a lot of it's jargon, and a lot of it is hard to interpret if you're not in the industry. So I think it's important to pick up the phone and speak to them. I think that's my experience from being an employee of an organisation. We, excuse me, we don't particularly maybe get a board level involved unless it is something that's going to make or break the project. It's for us at a kind of an operational level to try and work through it. But obviously, if you have experience on your board that would help you, then it's definitely important to reach out to them and ask their advice for it. Yeah, to that.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think I would agree with all of that. Also, I think working as a team, so trying to carry an individual project on your own shoulders, working with your board of directors, sharing responsibility, sharing the decision making, is really key as well. The other thing that we find really helpful is not, obviously, you know, in some things you have to respond to a certain thing within 15 days or whatever, but other times if someone's putting a lot of pressure on you, you don't have to respond to that time frame. You can respond when you're ready, having considered the response. So I think it's also just about, you know, calmly responding to challenging news in a way which gives you a chance to properly formulate that response, and then if we need change tack, and being able to be flexible as well.
Thanks. When I would have anyone.
Thank you both for that really interesting presentation. I think you captured a lot of things that resonate. One of the things that I'm hearing as you're talking is the problem that we have as small and rural communities versus the, let's just say, central bureaucrats. So I work in the policy area, I work in a very different policy area than global, and we follow the approach of opportunity-based policy. But I'm chair of Select Community Council and Director of the Community Trust here. Obviously, we have a problem at the moment with the Council for Landlords. Now, there's nothing we can do about it, and there's no real use because all of the legislation we have to do, all of the regulation we have to do, all of the people that we have to deal with are not opportunity-based, they're risk-based. Everything is based on starting from no, now prove it. And everything you both said is we need to change that to be opportunity focused, use a chance to do something, let it help it to go along. And my question is, who needs to talk about that? How can we convey that message to someone who's actually going to listen? Because right now, the policy and legislative framework in Scotland is anti-small communities. It's stopping us doing that, and it's costing us a lot of time and money. So, from your experience, what will change?
That was one of my questions.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think this you've touched on a number of key issues there. I think the problem is, one of the problems is that there's always a lag between, you know, the aspiration that Hollywood, you know, announces with a new policy or piece of legislation, and then how that's trickle down onto the ground. Like, a really example is the National Plan Framework Report, which has some really brilliant stuff in there about placing, you know, public interest-led development from a planning perspective. You know, sustainable development at the heart of it, placing community at the heart of it. That's the framework that the local place plans fit into, in terms of things intending to be more community-led and place-based. The problem is that that's great, but if you don't resource the planning teams, and if you don't make it easy, and you don't simultaneously ease up on all of the sort of the barriers in terms of administration and everything, then that's never going to happen. So at the moment, I really feel for the planning department staff, because they're so under-resourced, and there are so much demand from groups like us, but also a demand to be delivering all this other stuff. So I don't know quite what the solution is. I'm looking at Ariane. Ariane is, one of our regional MSPs, and is working very hard to address this. I think some of it is just about making sure that, the key departments have enough resources. Some of it's to do with land reform widely. We heard the earlier panel talk about a land reform bill and what may or may not be. We're yet to see, how much ambition that's actually really going to have. Some of it's about, in terms of what a community do to proactively respond to these really challenging circumstances. I think we've touched already on a lot of this. It's about forewarning yourself, forearming yourself with research, with information, peer networks, finding out what everyone else is doing. That's why I love Community Land Scotland conferences, because you get to meet so many amazing groups doing such inspiring things who are always just a little bit ahead of you. We're going to do a multi-sports pitch in Applecross. I need to talk to you afterwards about that, because you're like 6 months ahead of us on that project. And it's so good to be able to just actually learn from what everyone else is doing, and then you can maybe skip forward a few steps and make a few less missteps and get back on the track. I don't really feel like I've answered your question at all. I think it's a combination really of some things are changing in policy, but also we don't have to be victims. We can, I think, be organised and organise ourselves to be better able to respond to these challenges.
Oliver, I was going to have a simple answer, which
we need to work on this. There's something in this. We need to come up with policy demands or figure out how it fits in with land reform bill or whatever else that is. So it's clear. Plenty to be done here. Did you want to come in, Jane?
No, yeah, I think we've touched. Yeah.
I didn't have to come in. Someone else in family was over to. It's much easier than James.
I'm not coming in with any answer, I'm just going to ask questions. I think continuing on where we're going from, I can't remember your name, but around the whole kind of culture that's risk-based, and we need to move to opportunity. And Carey, you and I had a podcast, you talked about all the barriers and things, and I think I'm looking for the mind map that shows us all the problems that you learn how to do now. Three of you on our board. Your list at the end is brilliant. What I'm feeling me as somebody who's working forward is that my map shows here's this thing that we have to do in order to housing or whatever, and this is what we're up against, and I'm going to line through. And this is where this needs to be changed in policy in Hollywood, or this is actually just a conversation, it's a cultural change, how can start this here that's around taking one-stop shopping councils support for it. That's so that's what I need to understand is where is the stuff that's seen policy level and just is it possible that we need action there, and where is a cultural change and changing mindset from the risk aversion to the opportunity. And another piece for me that I just see is that we've got this legislation, Community Empowerment Act, etc. It talks about this community empowerment agenda. It's all this community finance and asset trends and so on and so forth. But it's like a superficial thing that's not actually it's not the other bits are not, because we were talking about the MDF4, you've got that, and the other bits are not falling in place. You mentioned, Megan, to cut up the roads and region, SSEN, and all that shopping list of everything that a key group is consulting. And they don't seem to have a kind of it's a community group, volunteer board that we need to treat in different ways. So how do we get there? So I'm really interested in that collective project that we could somehow do, which would be like I'm mapping all the problems and then triaging as to where they need to get sorted out. So not having answers, but just, I think if you can get that map moved down, and I can see it, and my colleagues can see it, and we can point at things and say, this needs to be handled in section 7, and this is the time to do it actually, manifesto time. What do you want to see in parties' manifestos? So questions are there. What can you tell us about?
same. Yeah, am I on?
Yes.
Yeah. Doesn't sound very loud when you're sitting here, so it's yeah. Yeah, I think that's very interesting. I think there's definitely policy and cultural issues that need to be bottomed out. I think at a policy level, there's something around not recognising maybe community groups as the bodies that are delivering a lot of these projects on the ground. I think even community groups aren't maybe even recognised like a profession in a sense of the stuff we're doing, like we're delivering housing and we're not maybe considered in the same way as like a social housing provider just due to the sort of the scale of the projects. And then there's a cultural thing around, like you say, if we're submitting applications, we're being treated the same way in every other application that's coming in, but we're not a developer, we're not a contractor in that sense. We don't know the ins and outs and the kind of the specifications and the details that need to go into planning applications. We're just trying to deliver the project and relying on a lot of other expertise to do it. So yeah, there's two kind of there's definitely is those two aspects, and I think there's something at both levels that needs to be looked at. And I think as well, obviously at policy level, I think rural planning is very different from obviously urban planning, and I don't know if that's really recognised enough. The examples that we had shown there around the sort of pavement basically that we had to put in, and it's like it's like of course that would be necessary in a more urban setting, but in a rural setting it just looks completely bizarre. It just is very strange, and it's also a lot of money. So it's maybe about bottoming out policies that are a bit more a bit more relevant to the place.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this question of using prescribed planning regulations as a blueprint, which might work in urban areas, but really don't work in sparsely populated rural areas, is a really good example of where there needs to be a much more flexibility so that you have parking on curbs or street lighting and things which is suitable to the local area. Because if we spend a lot of money with working with a design team who are specifically designing houses and an entire area to the local context and to the Gaelic heritage, that's utterly ruined then if you have to put in street lighting, which is, for a heavily urban area. And there's something really incompatible there in terms of how this is working. The other thing I just wanted to pick up on, which is one of the things that I bang on a lot, and that people like Ewan McLaughlin, who's must be in another session, always talks about as well, is that there's a real discrepancy in the degree of support. So a lot of, multi-million-pound private companies around, who are involved in the Comity Firth development, they have their own planning team in Highland Council. They have dedicated planning officers who work with them to walk through every step. All of the community groups who are trying to deliver projects which are small individually, but collectively are hugely important in terms of meeting the affordable housing needs in the Highlands and meeting the Scottish Government targets. We are not given that kind of individualised support at all. We are, each of us, having to learn the lessons ourselves, and I think it would make a huge difference if we simply had someone in the Highland Council, for example, planning department, and it's the same for all the other local authorities. If we had a person in Highland Council planning department who was dedicated towards helping community groups with affordable housing and other projects, that would make a huge amount of difference, rather than having to constantly be working with someone who doesn't understand the challenges of community-led housing. And I think there's a real deficiency there in terms of how much support that's given to big projects, because they're single big projects and you can put an individual value and impact from that, and not really seeing the collective value of all of the community-led efforts as well.
And two policy ideas listening to you talk. One is that it's a requirement of the 2019 Planning Act, Ariane will know well, to deliver rural repopulation, and the kind of ideas you're talking about would help Scottish Government do good on that legal obligation. At the minute, I don't know if there's clarity on how that's going to happen. The other one is, I've heard these questions around, Jane, your examples around the curb required has come up a lot in my research, and I was looking for Ewan and Rachel Skeen because they were in the room earlier, but they're not now. I was working with them with Northwest 2045, and they're having these kind of challenges as well up there. The roads are very small, but they have to put in double lane roads and huge turning bays. It's completely out of context. Listening to you talk today has made me realize that You could have something like a rural design guide, which you would get for like a conservation area, but instead of it being for a conservation area, it could be like in rural Scotland, these are the kind of curves which are appropriate, that kind of thing. And then that would help community groups with these kinds of things. So again, there's lots of work to be done, and we need to sit around a table and come up with ideas, questions. Yeah, he's been waiting.
Thank you, Richard Williams. So, I work for the Doyle Foundation, actually, stay in the Delegates. So, I guess my questions coming from both concepts. So, just on the planning part, I think, Megan's or the suggestion about sort of more dedicated support is really fundamental. I think so. There's been reference made to the fact that the planning, the council's planning team is under-resourced, which I'm sure it is the case, but actually we all pay for planning requests, planning applications to do the ones. So it's a paid service, we're all paying money, whether as individuals or as a community group putting in applications. So actually, I think we need to demand more for our money in terms of that dedicated service. But my question is actually about the local place plans. That, and just, I guess, maybe a wider question, but I've kind of been through these discussions about should one happen, is it worth doing, and I just wonder whether there's any kind of, maybe it's too early in the process, but are there examples of evidence of communities having a local place planning that has then subsequently made the planning process smoother and quicker? You know, that's the existence of a place planning, but we want to too early in the piece to go wrong as well.
You get all the questions. If you just make finding this last, let's get all the questions, and then we can answer. We can move in. Okay. Is there examples?
And all of them, this one, and we thought that it was one, and what we thought about it was we don't really know what we need to be, and that used to follow the question to be maybe say the structural help in planning, and you know, the problem there's more than enablers, and obviously housing trust is completely enablers. People in the community as community enablers, because the leadership is absolutely community enablement within the whole process, and all of those should be centrally supported something. And there's something else. Yeah, but and then the community planning community process was, and I think failed the balance to getting close.
Okay.
Offense to your hands, so just tell me where you're going.
Come down.
And this feels like a really basic question for so I'm wondering how often it's all part of like planning Scotland and things, and they've been very helpful in helping community groups like navigate all of these challenges.
And then it's to your one.
I think we should be looking at the finals that we visual bodies, such as forestry and soil, because the way that they operate in terms of the large challenges really absolutely the size, abilities, and a good example when we code building and should put together a big deal to set up as I said, building was to get zero, it's just 7 community houses. 7 is the size of one that they have. I'll tell you, these are the bodies which start to bring about and the government should be picking under these.
All right, one more question. Yeah.
My question was Now we're sitting is we've done something about projects, if processes, brought in professionals to help us with that. We're not supposed to know all those things. And unfortunately, we found you can't always rely on professionals to go right and to actually think about it and not this stuff. Is that's your experience and what you live in?
Okay. Yeah, okay, where to start?
Do you want to go first? I don't try full of this.
Okay, trying to write down some notes for all the questions, so I'll just touch on a couple of them. So in terms of the local police plan, to answer your question about have we seen an example of somebody having a police plan and haven't got a plan application? Personally, no, I've not actually been at that stage yet. We're still in the process of getting our local police plan completed and submitted to the local authority, but the community back in 2008, a long time ago, had a master plan, and it was essentially the same sort of thing as a local police plan. It kind of laid out the ambitions in terms of housing, any plots we wanted to sell for private residential builds and so on. And as far as I'm aware, that did feed into the planning process at the time, but obviously that was a long time ago. I don't personally have experience of a local police plan, then therefore making the process easier, but in terms of planning, but that's what we're told that it should. Don't know, Megan, if you've got anything to add to that one.
Yeah, I think it is too early to tell about whether local police plans are going to have already a direct impact. We've decided not to do one yet, despite the fact that planning council had that ridiculous deadline last summer because it didn't suit our planning need. We want to do a place plan when it's the right time for us in our long-term planning process, but we're now having to justify that to a vendor who's asking us why we don't have a place plan. So it's a bit frustrating at the moment, but I guess that's another good example of something that was supposed to be a community empowerment tool, which is now becoming a community stick to beat communities, which is a bit frustrating. Some of the other things, community enablers. Yeah, Davey, I think you asked about this. I think they're really, really key. I think we need more of them at every level. If they can help, maybe help communities find the right professional advice. So I think that's also really critical. You know, there's communities are suddenly expected to be experts on everything. We can't possibly be experts on, and especially our volunteer directors can't do that. So we do need advice, but unfortunately, it's not easy to get the right advice, and sometimes the best intention advice can be not what you need and what you wanted, or in some cases wrong. But I think if there were more support services available to communities, that might help them do that, get the right advice. Was there anything else you wanted to pick up on?
I think so now about the pre-planning process and essentially we got anything out of it, and to be honest, not ideal. Usually the response is something that's a bit kind of copy and paste from the local development plan that says this countryside zone, so you're permitted to do X, Y, Z, and it maybe doesn't feel that particular to your project. But what we've found is, even though that we might not get the information we want out of that process, we certainly get the relationship that we want to build with the planners out of that process. So it engages them in the project, and I think it also just, yeah, it kind of goes in a good footing with your planner. It's, yeah, you want to build a good relationship with these people because obviously they could make it quite difficult for you. Other questions we got?
I think there were two more, so I'm happy to tell them. That's okay. So Planning Aid Scotland, we work with Planning Aid Scotland in a very in-depth way to develop a community land use plan, which was supposed to be turned into a local place plan, and that didn't happen for reasons that it's too boring to go into at this stage. But they were fantastic in terms of what they did. So yeah, I think they are a really good resource. I think they've been very stretched because lots of community groups are trying to do local place planning processes at the same time, and there's not enough advisors who can help communities in general. I've had a really positive experience with them. And then Rob, your question on banks, and I mean, there should be surely the position that a publicly owned land should be delivering more for the public good and doing that better than anyone else, and it's clearly not always happening. So yeah, I would agree that there's more needs to be done to make sure that publicly Ireland is doing the best it absolutely can do and meeting all of the government guidance and policies around community engagement and involving communities in decision making.
I think, yeah, just a final comment back to the local police plan. I realise that sounds very a reputation as like, yeah, just get a local police plan. I realise that it's not as easy as that. It's a lot of time, resourcing. If you have a local community council that would work with your community trust or whatever to enable that to happen, I think it's a good thing to have in terms of for your own purposes as well as for all these other agencies that are looking for it. But yeah, just to add that kind of last comment that I appreciate that is a lot of work and it's not an easy thing to do or achieve, and there maybe does need to be a bit more support in delivering these type of plans to meet policy requirements.
Just specifically on the local police plans, because it's something that I've been worried about, because in PF4 and then putting that SSI on local police plans in 2022, and there is this, so I always ask the question of the government's planning, areas that head of transport and planning, and actually used a committee last Tuesday, and I chased him out of the room and I said, Andy, I'm really worried about these local police plans, are they really going to be honoured? Because there's so many communities across Scotland doing them. I'm spending a lot of money on time and effort, and some of them are all fantastic. So he's now put me in touch with, he said, oh, yes, yes, they should be. He just put me in touch with the woman who is doing research, and I've got a meeting with her next week. So I would like to suggest that what I hear from her, it might be good for CMS to do maybe an online discussion with her and see what she's found. And then what my committee, so I didn't introduce myself before, I am there just FSP in Highlands region. I convene the local government and housing planning committee, business day, planning day next week. And I'm going to say we need to do a session on local police plans. So I'm going to make sure we take evidence on this, because I think it's going to be really frustrating and heartbreaking if everyone does all this local police plans and then it's not honoured. Someone will say to me, oh, we've got the community so focusing on police plans and nobody looking at development plans, and maybe that's really the place that people should be looking at. I also think in the case of MacIntyre, and Forest had it as well, Forest did some planning for a rural session 2020, vision to 2020, so it was done in 2015. I think those things should be just considered for local. And the other thing I heard with the new trustee, what they found is they had to also do a community action plan and parallel. So that's an interesting uncovering. It's not just about, if you're going to design things that go in places, you also need to know your action plan. So, yeah, I also agree there. So anyway, I'll be back to CMS and we can take that forward.
Thanks everyone for coming. That was really great.